what is the sixth QIN session that we've run. So the sixth meeting of the Quality Improvement Network. Uh, Very pleased to say that today we're going to be joined, well, we are joined by Tom Woodcock, who's a senior research fellow at the School of Public Health, Imperial College London, who's going to be talking to us about statistical process control analysis. You can see the title on his slides very nicely. So sustained improvement or transient gain. I will let Tom give more background to his work and the work that he's going to be talking about. But just wanted to give a warm welcome to Tom, who's going to make sure we've got some time for discussion at the end as well, which is great. So please do, if you've got any questions as we go along, put them in the chat, or feel free to save them at the end and we can do hands up and a bit of discussion online. So I'm going to hand over to Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Great, thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I think I've been to a couple of these now, and they've always been really great sessions. So I was really pleased when Nick emailed around looking for presenters for this one, and I hope that what I've got to say will be of some interest. So this is a very long-standing piece of work. Those of you who've known me for a long time, I'm thinking Rowan and maybe a few others on the call, will remember right back in the days of the CLARC, Collaboration for Leadership in Applied Health Research and Care. We were doing a lot of work with statistical process control with quality improvement teams across North West London. And a problem came out of that work. And after many, many years of work, we've come up with what we think is a solution to that problem. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the problem, a bit of background, then a bit about the problem, a bit about the potential solution, and where we're at now. So yeah, my background is I'm originally as a mathematician, long lapse now, and I've been working in quality improvement research and health services research for about the last 16 years or so now. And so hence my interest in the kind of data analytics side of things. These days I do a lot of work with large electronic health record data. This work stems from a kind of an earlier period, but we've kept it going because I think it's really important. So I'm going to flip through these slides. So this is the outline which I've just been over. So first of all, I know that not everyone will know what statistical process control is, and so I just wanted to give a very brief overview of what this is. I'm not going to spend ages on this because that could be a whole, kind of tutorial in SPC could be a whole session in its own right. But basically, SPC is a data analysis approach used in quality improvement often to learn from data relating to the quality of care. It provides tools to distinguish different kinds of variation in the data, often over time, but not always. And the two kinds of variation that SPC invites us to think about are common cause variation, which is variation which is inherent to the process and is going to be there unless something changes and do the same stuff, the same variation over time. And that's distinct from special cause variation, which is somehow not inherent to the process, it's sort of external to the process. It might be due to an improvement effort, or it might be due to something going wrong. And either way, we want to know about it and we want to learn from it. So the primary tool of statistical process control is this thing called the Shewhart chart or the control chart, which is very simple. There's some references at the end. There's a great tutorial article here by Mohammed, which would take you through the basics if you're interested. But essentially, you have some data plotted over time. And then you have this center line, this solid line here, which is somehow the average of this measure over this time period. And then you have these two dotted lines, which are called control limits, or sometimes they're called natural process limits. And they encapsulate the sort of expected variation if we just have this common cause variation. So in other words, if the process, nothing changes and the process keeps doing what it's always done, then the data will sort of remain within these limits here. For the statistically minded among you, they are set at 3 standard deviations from the center line, but the way in which you calculate that standard deviation is quite specific. So it's not, so you have to be careful you do it the right way. Again, I'm not going to go into details of that because there's lots of detail available in the literature if you're interested. So how do we use that to, and I should say, here you can see we've calculated the control limits in the center line from this first period of data, like a baseline, and then we extend it out into the future fixed. And so we can plot data against this and look for changes against the baseline. That's the idea in quality improvement. That's how we use it. How do we identify special cause variation? Well, SPC comes with these rules. You get different combinations of rules, rule sets that are used. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the relative merits of different rule sets here, but a common set of rules is as follows. Any single point outside the control limits, rule 1. Rule 2, a run of consecutive points, 8 or more, all on the same side of the center line. That's called a shift. That will be important for this talk. And then 6 or more consecutive points, all ascending or all descending. That's a trend. We won't use that one too much today. And just to note that you get different cutoffs here. So particularly the shift rule here, people use 7, people use 8, people use 9. There's a great textbook, the Healthcare Data Guide by Lloyd Provost and Sandra Murray. They recommend 8 for healthcare improvement. There's no real. So I would always start with 8 there as your shift rule cutoff. So this is what rule 1 looks like. A single point outside the control limits. That's evidence that something is different to what was happening before in this baseline period. We would want to investigate that, find out what was different and learn from it, take action if necessary. This is the shift. So you've got 8 points here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all on the same side of the center line, all above the center line in this case. That's evidence that the process is shifting. And if this is something important we're measuring here and up is good, then this might be a good sign that an improvement initiative is making a difference. Just very brief potted history. This came from work of Walter Schuhart, originally in the Bell Telephone Laboratories in the 1920s, picked up by W. Edwards Deming, who applied it in industrial manufacturing, notably car manufacturing, and particularly with Toyota in Japan. And then it was brought back, he brought it back to the States later in his career. FPC was adopted in healthcare in the 1990s. People like Paul Batalden and others at the IHI started using it, saw the potential for quality improvement. And today it's in widespread use in healthcare environments. It's been demonstrated to be effective in improving patient outcomes. So this references as a cluster randomized trial of surgical teams in France that demonstrated that SPC was associated with improved patient outcomes for patients, so including mortality and post-operative complications. And it's also been demonstrated to be superior to usual practice, as it were, in identifying surgical site infections early. Another reference there. But the fidelity of use of SPC, so how well people use the method against how it's supposed to be used, is highly variable. We did a scoping review where we found that a third of articles don't report the rule set they use. So it's a bit like not specifying your alpha cutoff for research. So not saying what your level of significance is, 0.05 being the standard. So if you're using a different rule set with 7, 8, or 9 with a shift rule, for example, you really should be specifying what that is. 70% of articles don't report how they do something called re-establishing limits, which is the main topic of this talk. So I'm going to go on to talk about that in a moment. So what do we mean by re-establishing the control limit? So let's suppose that this shift that we saw continued on for a long period of time like this. Clearly, this is if up is good, clearly this is an improvement, an improved process. And the old control limits no longer represent this process. So we want to re-establish the control limits so they represent the new process, like this. So now this no longer shows up as a rule break highlighted in blue because it's not a rule break against the new control limits. So now you can clearly see the old process was operating with an average of 99 with this variation expected, and it's shifted up to an average of 150. So this is important because in quality improvement, for example, this is how we capture the improvement that we claim we've made. So if you're using statistical process control to inform improvement and then also to evaluate improvement, these are the numbers you're going to cite in your kind of write-up, right? You're going to say, well, we improved the average performance from 99 to 149. So how you establish these, how you decide when to do it, and the resulting numbers that you get out are really important. They capture some of the most important outputs of this analysis that you can have. So why is this difficult? This looks very obvious, right? You've got a massive rule break. We just re-establish limits, no problem. Is everything I've said so far making reasonable sense? Please do stop me if anything's not clear. Okay, cool. So keeping an eye on the time as well, right? Good. So why is it difficult? Why do we need to think about this at all? So let's take another example. Here we've got a process trundling along, rule break, shift rule break happening. Let's suppose we decide that we're going to recalculate, re-establish the control limits every time we see a rule break. You're an improvement team, you want to see the improvement that you're seeking. Okay, so here we go, we've got a rule break, let's just recalculate straight away. Brilliant, we've got an improvement. Problem is, what happens if it goes back down again is one issue. What you tend to do here, because the literature recommends between a minimum of between 17 and 25 data points to establish these control limits. So if you do this, you haven't really got enough data for these limits to be stable. Okay, so rather than fixing them and extending them out on such a tiny amount of data, what people do is tend to update the limits as they add more data until they've got enough, and then say, okay, right, now we've got enough, these limits look stable, we'll extend these out, and that's our next period. Okay. So, but here, as you do that, it drops back down again. It comes back down towards the original process. And really, we might actually end up regretting ever having recalculated that. Maybe it was just a blip, a transient improvement, not a sustained improvement that we're looking for. Because in fact, if we're recalculating every time we have a rule break, then look, we've got another rule break here, another shift rule break, back down towards the original process. So let's recalculate again. Here we go. Now we're stuck with these limits calculated from not enough data, right? We shouldn't really ever have recalculated here. So we're regretting decisions that we made before about when to recalculate. And the same thing goes on again. Here we go, we've got another rule break. Okay, so if we take this simplistic approach of saying, well, let's reestablish our control limits every time we see a shift rule break. The shift rule break is SPC's way of saying the process has moved, so that seems reasonably logical to begin with. But we run into problems. We have this issue of not having enough data to form new limits. And therefore, if the shift is transient, we might end up regretting reestablishing limits. We could just forget it and say, okay, that was a mistake. We'll just go back to the original control limits and extend those across the whole period. But then you've got this issue of disappearing improvement. Where's that improvement gone that we had? That's confusing. It doesn't instill confidence in the method of analysis. Say you reported to your board that you've got, great, we've made an improvement. And then, oh, sorry, actually, that wasn't an improvement. It was only transient. It doesn't instill confidence in the methods. And also, you might have taken action. You might have gone, okay, well, that's great. Let's we don't need to seek any further improvement. Well, that's wrong because it clearly wasn't going to stick around. So we could take an ad hoc approach. We could say, well, actually, let's just let the analyst, the SPC analyst, decide when it's time to lock in these limits, when it's time to re-establish. That avoids this kind of like the methodological difficulties of having to state in advance what your strategy for re-establishing limits is. And that's actually what a lot of teams do. This is the kind of, I guess, the default is that the analyst just decides when to re-establish control limits. It looks right now, let's re-establish limits. But the problem is that's not really defensible when we want to use SPC for research studies or for rigorous evaluation of QI because of all the issues we just talked about. And it's also not feasible when organizations are seeking to use SPC at large scale. So, for example, we did a bit of work with the East of England Ambulance Trust, and they had hundreds of measures that they are monitoring each month. And it's just not feasible for an analyst to go through every single one every month and check whether it's time to re-establish the control limits or not. So you need some automated approach to doing this if you want to have control limits that reflect the process. So that's where this new algorithm that we've developed comes in. This is a sort of suggested or offered potential solution to this problem. We sought an algorithm that had the following properties. We wanted it to re-establish limits when you had a persistent shift, but not when you had a transient shift in the measure. We thought it should remain within the kind of realm of SPC. We don't want to use like a Bayesian model to decide when to re-establish limits, or a machine learning model, or even a frequentist hypothesis test, because we're trying to ensure that these methods can be used and understood by quality improvement teams working on the front line of healthcare. And we know that typical quality improvement teams don't have strong statistical skills in advanced statistical methods. Why would they? And so, but this FPC does have this traction in quality improvement, that people know about it, they understand to some extent that the rules are there. And so if we can frame this algorithm just in terms of the rules of SPC, we think that's the strength. We don't want to allow calculation of control limits using less than some pre-specified minimum number of points. So I showed you there that if you just follow the rule of re-establishing limits every time you get a shift rule break, then you can end up with these sort of orphan periods of only like 8 points or something, which is not enough. So you should be able to choose some minimum. Say, okay, I'm going to go with what Donald Wheeler recommends, which is 17 data points as a minimum. Or I've got monthly data, so I'm going to go with 24 points as my minimum, because then I've got at least 2 whole seasonal cycles in there. I'm not being too badly affected by seasonality, etc., etc. So the algorithm, in other words, is agnostic to whatever that minimum is. And the algorithm also should not change its mind when you add more data to the series, except when it's waiting for sufficient data to form a new period, right? So because we have this minimum number of data points, we can't re-establish limits until we've got enough data. Yeah. But other than that, it shouldn't change its mind. Okay, so here let's try the same data set we just looked at with that kind of orphan period, and let's look at that again. So we add the data. Here comes the rule break. Before we would have just recalculated, but the algorithm says, hang on, we don't have enough data yet. So we keep watching. Now we would have had enough data here to re-establish limits, but it decides not to because the process has gone back to where it was before. Here's another rule break. This one, when we get enough data, it doesn't go back. And so the algorithm says, yeah, let's recalculate there. So we've managed to keep this rule break. We still have the information that there was a shift upwards for 8 days. In this case, this is daily data, 8 days. We still want to go and investigate that. We still want to find out what happened. We might be able to learn from it. We might be able to, if up is good, we might be able to bake that in. Maybe that's how we learn how to do this, how to improve the process at the end. So this is still that I'm not saying, when I say that we should not re-establish control limits at a transient shift, I'm not saying we therefore should just discard that information and treat it as not important. It absolutely is important. It's just that there's a distinction between a transient shift and a sustained shift, and we need to be able to recognize that. And that's what this algorithm, one of the things this algorithm does. Okay. So what is the algorithm? How does it work? I've spent years trying to get this right, and I think we've got it to a stage now where it sort of is as good as it's going to get for the time being, at least. It was felt a bit like trying to defeat a Hydra, or Medusa kind of thing, because every time we fixed one problem, it seemed to make something else worse with the algorithm. But eventually we got there. I'm definitely not going to go through every step of this, but this is the flowchart for how the algorithm works, basically. But basically what it does is, and to simplify, it says, yeah, let's consider recalculating when we see a shift rule break, but we better check that the process hasn't gone back to where it was before. How do we do that? We look for rule breaks back in the other direction. So if you establish these candidate limits, you kind of pretend you're going to recalculate limits, and then you check to see whether there's a rule break going back in the original direction towards the original process. And if there is, you just say, nope, we're not going to recalculate at that original triggering rule break. We'll carry on and look for subsequent rule breaks. That's basically how it works. And we've called this the stable shift algorithm because it still uses shift rule breaks, but the idea is to only re-establish limits when the shift is stable. We did a simulation study to look at how this performs against its goal of not re-establishing a transient shift. So if you have across the top here, you've got transient shifts of different lengths. So let's say a little blip of length 6 points, a little blip of length 8 points, like the one we saw just there, and a slightly longer blip of length 10 points. And then along the x-axis here, you've got how big is that? So how far from the average does this little blip stick up? Yeah. And so you can see in all cases, So we're comparing, by the way, here the kind of simplistic approach that I showed at the beginning of just recalculating every time you see a shift rule break with the stable shift algorithm. You can see that as the size of the transient gets bigger, with the simplistic approach, you always end up recalculating more often, even though it's, inverted commas, wrong to do so because it's only transient. Whereas with the stable shift algorithm, yes, initially very small shifts you do because, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. But then it starts to catch it and it drops off. So once we get big enough shifts, the stable shift algorithm is much less likely to re-establish limits than the sort of simpler approach. Reason why it kind of only slightly reduces this for small shifts is because if you think about it, if you only have a small shift and the limits get re-established, it's actually less likely you're going to see a rule break back towards the original process because it's so close. So your probability of getting 8 points in a row below the center line is actually lower than if you've gone a long way from the original process. That's why you see this behavior. But that's okay, because for small shifts, it doesn't really matter because you're not concluding that things have changed very much. So it's actually the algorithm kind of starts to do better exactly when you need it to, in a way. And this is consistent across different chart types. Those of you who know about SPC will know you have different types of charts for different types of data. So a C chart for count data, for example, number of attendances, number of appointments, number of did not attends, and a P chart for proportions, percentage of did not attends, for example. And you also have this XMR chart, which is like a Swiss Army knife chart that will work for pretty much any kind of data, but was originally designed for individual data points. That's all I'm going to say on the different chart types. But so the simulation study basically shows that the algorithm does reasonably well against this kind of goal of not recalculating too often for transients. I'm going to show you some real examples. So here's some data from Scotland showing people presenting at ED, at A&E, number, and this is a particular department over time. So you can see the algorithm kind of re-establishing when these shifts in attendance numbers happen. This is number of ambulance attendances at the similar, I think it's the same department, and showing this kind of slight decrease over time. So those are, there's a couple of real examples. There's more in, I'm going to talk about the paper that we've that's coming out soon on this, and there's more examples in that. This has been used monthly since June 2021 in one form or another by a team of Scottish Government and Public Health Scotland analysts on emergency care data. So that's where some of that data comes from. We used it weekly during the height of the COVID pandemic to monitor case numbers by age group and borough in Northwest London. That was reported on a bi-weekly basis to the COVID Gold Command group. And I've also used it with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Research Dissemination Network in the US to look at improvements in cystic fibrosis care. So we've got some examples of it being used in practice already. So to summarize some kind of strengths of this approach, it provides a rigorous and transparent approach to re-establishing control limits. And I think that's really important because this would enable research teams to state in advance how they are going to re-establish control limits in, say, a protocol for an evaluation or a research study, which at the moment, there's just no way to do that for SPC, unless you say something like we're going to re-establish control limits at every rule break, and we've seen that that's problematic. So I think this opens the door to a more scientific application of SPC. SPC has this reputation for being compared with traditional research statistics for being less rigorous, less kind of scientifically valid. But there's no reason why it needs to be. That's just down to how people use it. So I think this hopefully will help give people a way to use it rigorously. No one's ever published in a peer-reviewed journal an algorithm for deciding when to re-establish control limits before. So when it comes out, this will be the first one. There are approaches recommended in textbooks, but they tend to be a little bit less, they tend to be not kind of fully specified. So there's one textbook, for example, that says you should re-establish once you're sure that the process is stable. Well, What do you mean by stable? It's reasonably straightforward to apply, partly because it only uses the rules of SPC. It minimizes the re-establishment of limits for transient shifts, as we demonstrated in the simulation study, and it allows for at least partial automation of SPC analyses at scale. So the Scotland team have been using this to analyze hundreds, I think, of metrics each month, and it just, that kind of work is not possible with SPC, and that, with the typical resources NHS organisations tend to have. Otherwise, it's available to use for free as an R package. So these slides will be available for you. So there's a website here which shows you how to install the package if you're an R user. It gives you some examples of how to use it. It does have limitations, of course. It can't replace analysts because there are these cases when it doesn't work very well, usually when there's no obvious best recalculation point. So you've got to decide what to do about that. Things like autocorrelation break SPC in general, not just this algorithm. So you need an analyst on hand to be able to deal with complicated issues like that. And it definitely should not replace or limit action on special cause variation. So like I said, if you see a rule break, you still need to investigate that. You don't wait for there to be for the limits to be re-established. You go and take action on your rule breaks as usual. And in common with the shift rule on which it is based, it's going to be slow to pick up small but persistent shifts. So if you have a small improvement over a long period of time, it takes a long time for the shift rule to detect that. There are other charts that are better placed to detect that kind of change, things like Q-sum charts and UMA charts. Out of scope of this presentation. At the moment, the only way to use it is through R. So if you're not an R user, then there isn't a kind of easy way to use it unless you want to go and work through the flowchart to decide what to do. But I'm exploring integrations with the R package with Power BI, and I'm also planning a sort of Shiny app web application where you could drop some data in if you have it, and it will apply the algorithm and produce a chart. But that's a little way off at the moment. And it can handle at the moment C charts, P charts, and XMR charts, as well as the prime versions of the C and P charts, so C prime and P prime charts. But it can't, the package, the algorithm will work with whatever chart type. But yeah, so we've yet to introduce, for example, T charts and G charts into the code, for those of you who know what that means. In conclusion, then, I think we need an approach to recalculation, to re-establishing limits. We can't just do it in an ad hoc way. We want to avoid the confusion that ensues when you have to go back and say, actually, no, we shouldn't have re-established limits there. We need it for scientific rigor to be able to state our methods in advance, so we need it for automation. So this algorithm provides an approach, the first published approach, with some desirable features and some limitations. You can also see, for those of you who are R-minded, there's a code repo there. It's got all the code. And the paper is accepted. Finally, we're delighted to say the paper is accepted. And I got the proofs over the last few days, and there are just a few typos that are being corrected. So it should be out soon. So if you click on this link now, it doesn't work. It just takes you to a page saying that doesn't exist. But as soon as the paper's out, this link will take you to the paper, which is going to be out in BMJ Quality and Safety soon. There's a couple of references there that I mentioned as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to shut up now, and very open to any comments or questions that you may have.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Big thank you from me. I love how you describe SPC, actually. I almost sometimes wish I could like pocket your explanations. Well, it's recorded actually, so I can just share it. Yeah. So that's it. So actually we have got it able to share. So open to the group. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or anything you want to unpick. There is no question too complicated or too simple that Tom won't be able to answer, I'm sure.
Certainly try. But yes, please.
Yeah, feel free to put hands up as well if people want to ask questions. I can see people typing. Feel free to come off mute. Tensions building. Go on, Nick.
I'll kick things off because people are typing in the chat. It's a basic question, one coming from a position of ignorance. Do you feel that the benefits of this to a QI team is to aid responsive decision making, or just to monitor and measure? So the point is this seems to give you a lot of information about what's affecting a change or what's causing it. Is that to be used in real time to inform decision making, as in to continue with an intervention or not, or for retrospective reporting and communicating your work after the project is completed?
Yeah. So one of the great strengths of SPC is that it can be used for both formative and summative evaluation if you want. But in other words, it can be used in real time as you go along. And that's the main point actually of SPC. The whole reason it was invented is to give statistically valid real-time feedback as to when changes are happening in a process that you're measuring, right? It's just that in healthcare, we often also want to be able to look back in retrospect and say, well, did we make a difference? And one thing that I think is important is that the method gives you a consistent answer to that question, whether you're using it formatively or summatively. So there's no point as you go formatively along saying, okay, we're going to reestablish limits here. We made an improvement, only for the same analysis when done retrospectively to say, well, actually, there wasn't an improvement there. It needs to be consistent. And again, that's something this algorithm gives us. In general, the SPC analysis itself does not tell you the cause of the change. You have to go away and do your investigation, whatever that might be, whether it's analyzing further data that you have available, or whether it's just going and talking to people who are working in the process and saying, hey, what was happening last week? This looks like there's been a change. That's a fundamental part of quality improvement, right? Is that qualitative investigation. And the big change that SPC gives you there is it gives you an objective way of doing that rather than relying on our human fallible subjective judgment as to when an improvement has really happened or not. So yeah, absolutely. SPC, unlike, say, if you're doing research evaluation, if you're doing an evaluation of a quality improvement study and you're using, say, an interrupted time series design to evaluate, really great design. One of the strong, if you use ITF with controls, it's one of the strongest observational study designs you can use to evaluate an intervention over time. But you can't use that on a week-on-week basis to inform the improvement as it progresses and make sure that you, because, as anyone who's worked in improvement knows, it's useless to find out 12 months, 18 months into a project that it's not working. You need to know early enough that you can change what you're doing, PDSA, iterate, and make it work. And so that's one of the major strengths of SPC, is that it does that for you in a statistically valid way. Does that answer your question, Nick?
It really does. It's really helpful to know about the ways it can be deployed and applied. So thank you. That's really helpful.
Great. I can see there's a question. Is it Wei in the chat there?
Yeah, so it's not really a question. It's more a request, a very kind request.
Well, I mean, I think I have looked at this in the past, so I'm aware of the work that NHS England have done on SPC, and often this is led by Sam Riley and the Making Data Count team, right? And what their work is fantastic, and they've done a great job in spreading the word about SPC and in enabling, especially boards, to be more aware of what it can do and ideally to take it up and use it. I've been talking to Sam and the team about this work for quite a while, and I think having the paper published and out there is going to help, because Sam has been recommending an approach to the NHS for a long time, and she can't just drop that approach and say, hey, now we're going to use this thing that Tom's come up with. So having it gone through the process of peer review, and we've done this simulation study now, which sort of shows what it can do, I'm planning to reconnect with Sam and sort of say, what do you think? Is this something that you might recommend for those interested? We did talk about doing a sort of pilot of a team or teams using this in practice to see whether it helps. One of the issues actually is that teams using this in practice, especially if you're using it monthly, right? If you're using SPC to plot monthly data, and you're taking the literature seriously when it says you need at least 17 data points to establish a set of control limits. 17 months is a long time, and so many quality will be finished within that time. And so if I'm saying, well, you can't re-establish limits to give yourself evidence of your improvement until you've got 17 months worth of data, that's off-putting for people. Now, my response to that is, well, the solution is not to use fewer data points to establish your limits. The solution is to measure more frequently. So you should be measuring weekly or daily, because it's the resolution, it's that frequency of measurement that gives you the signals that SPC is designed to interpret. If you're looking for, even forget the re-establishment of limits, if you're looking for shifts in the process, you need 8 data points in a row to trigger consideration of what's happened.
Yeah.
8 months is far too long for that. So SPC, I don't think really works very well, especially not in the formative prospective mode with monthly data. It's really designed for much more real-time data, like daily or weekly. So, and that was one of the issues that cropped up when we were working with Otis England on this, is we can't wait that long. But that's not, in a way, that's not to do with the algorithm. That's to do with, are you following best practice in terms of the number of data points that you're using to establish your control limits or not. And what we have done in response to that is in the package, in the Auto SPC package, the R package, we've introduced a feature that enables you to add what's called, this is from the Healthcare Data Guide book that I mentioned by Provost and Murray. They recommend in this situation where you might have the beginnings of an improvement, but you haven't got enough data yet to re-establish limits. They suggest using a floating median. So you put a median line on the chart to represent the most recent 10 to 12 data points. And that gives you a sense of what the improvement is, a more stable statistic, and can cope with much smaller amounts of data. So that's an approach, and we've implemented that now. So there's an argument in the plotting function of this package that enables you to switch on a floating median at the end. And I'm hoping that will also help with piloting with teams who need that rapid feedback. So yeah, so I think sorry, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think that I haven't looked at it recently, but I think that the resources that are offered by the Making Data Count team and NHS England are really good. And I'm hoping to be able to work with them going forward to see whether there's an appetite for this work, to adopt this work.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. And yeah, really looking forward to reading your paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Thank you, Tom.
It doesn't have to just be questions, by the way. It could be someone saying, Tom, I haven't understood a word that you're saying, and I think you're talking absolute nonsense. Because it's important to know if that's how things are coming across. So please don't hold back if you've got things that you don't understand or you think are wrong, or you'd like to challenge, then please speak up as well. Robert, hello.
Hey, I'm Rob.
Rob, hi.
Not a challenge at all, because this is, I'm more at the kind of practical end of this, and particularly some of you kind of helpful explanations in this about how you do some of this practically, I suppose, reassures me about the way that I've been applying SPC and limit recalculation, kind of going, great. We'll sort of do this how we like, essentially, and hope that it fits, and what do you do when it doesn't. So I think, I'm far more at the sharp end of where we're feeling this. I suppose, have you had any conversations either at Imperial or North West London APC level with any of our data teams? I know it looks like there's 1 or 2 people on from that end of the world here about how we actually get this into some of our data. I'm particularly thinking, the report that I see most regularly is a weekly incident summary that goes to our execs, that has some, I think, if we shared it with some people who had more rigorous methodology about what it's showing would probably say that quite a lot of it was wouldn't stand up to many arguments, and having something automated that might help some of the teams that are just trying to do something practically about how do you take lots of complicated data and interpret it easily and consistently. This kind of thing would help massively. I suppose you've kind of touched on some of the practical aspects of how do we just get this into Click that we can use and it starts working. That's sort of it. I don't have any control or knowledge about how to do that, but it sounds like we use locally at Imperial we used making data counts, I think drop-ins for Click to build there. So some of that's practical bits, but some of the adoptability as well. It'd be helpful to kind of hear if you've had any of those conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I have spoken with local colleagues about SPC more broadly than specifically this algorithm over the last sort of 10 to 15 years really. But so for example, a couple of years ago, I was working with Kavita and her team at the ICB, the WYSIC team, to do a bit of SPC training work to see how that might be adopted for some of the urgent emergency care stuff. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the key barriers to this is the fact that as an academic, I write in R, and a lot of people in the NHS don't use R yet, and so there's a bit of a gap there. So I think, as I say, I have made some headway. I did manage to get it to run from within Power BI. I haven't tried it through ClickView yet, but I understand that it does have an R integration, so we may be able to do that way. I'm definitely interested in any teams that might be interested or willing to pilot this. And both in terms of those kind of plumbing type issues of how do we actually get it to connect with the data and produce an output in a way that people can access, but also in terms of how is it working for people in practice? Does it work well? And I'd like to do that regardless, but I'd also like to try and get that written up as a research study, as an evaluation of the algorithm, as it were, because I think that's the next step. What was the other thing I was going to say? Yeah, also, I mean, that's one of the things that Sam said to me that it would be essential for her before considering whether this could be embedded into their tooling. Because, of course, as you say, that I'd love that to happen if we could get there, so that it becomes something which, because lots of people in the NHS are using their tools, their integrations. But I completely understand that Sam can't also, and I wouldn't want her to, her team to just pick up any old approach that someone's dreamed off the top of their head. So I think I've been waiting for this paper to come out before I go back and say, okay, we've got a little bit more kind of, consensus on this, at least being as an approach of interest. And I think the next thing will be to get some pilot sites to try it. So yeah, if you or your team or other teams that you're aware of might be interested in piloting this, then I'm super keen to explore that.
That sounds like music to my ears. I suppose I personally am interested in this. I can't say whether Imperial as an organisation,
of course,
necessarily, but I'll send you an email offline and we can try and set up a meeting with some people that have a little bit more control over some of this.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I was also planning to write to Bob to let him know about this work, because I haven't spoken to him about it for a while. And again, now that the paper's out, and see whether he's got interest in kind of piloting it. Because it seems like we should try to take advantage of this in North West London, given that we've developed it here.
Yeah, just to add to that, whether the organisation's interested in it, based on who's on this call, you've got Rob, Jonathan, Way, and me, all from Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. So I think there's a fair degree of interest there already. Yeah, definitely worth sending the paper to Bob. Yeah. But I think, if we could be a pilot site, either if you wanted to start locally because academic health trust linked to the university, or go through Sam and do some national type work and we come in as a pilot site, I think there's a high chance that you're going to get a yes from our side.
Thank you, Ben.
Even if all the decision makers aren't here right now, I think it's fair to say kind of, I don't know, proceed until apprehended for a little bit maybe. But I'm cool. I'll happily take the flak on that one.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Ben. I've also got some interest from East London Foundation Trust as well, because they do a lot of work on the kind of QI side of things. So I'm actually thinking of putting together some kind of grant next year to look at with a few pilot sites of this to try and get some funding to support the work as well.
Right. Very good. Well, great discussion, great thoughts. Please do share the paper, Tom, and the slides. Actually, yeah, the link to the R code as well. You said that was freely available online.
Yeah, that's here. So if you can just click on that, where's it gone? Click on that link here. I don't know why the links aren't highlighting, but where it says here, that will, hold on a sec. Why can't I move this across? All right.
We'll believe you.
That gives you the GitHub repo here, which has got all the code in, and how to try it in R if you're so inclined.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate joining us. And
pleasure.
Hopefully you don't mind if people get in touch with you directly as well. We've got your email address.
Please do. Yeah, please do. I'd be delighted to take this further with anyone who's interested.
And as if by magic, Nick has put the date of the next QIN, next two QIN sessions in the chat. So please do add these to your diaries. It'd be great to get people along. And we are always looking for volunteers to present during sessions. It doesn't need to be fully formed publication ready research. It can also be half-baked ideas that you just want to sense check and run by people, get an opportunity to get a group of people who are doing work that's similar in a similar area together. Even if it's people who aren't working on anything related to your work, it can sometimes be quite a nice way of just testing your findings or the work that you're doing. Anything in the improvement space, we're very, very open and flexible. So if you do have anything you want to bring to a future session, please do get in touch with us. Nick is the holder of the plan for the next few sessions, so Nick will be happy to be contacted. We will send out an email call for volunteers as well, I think, won't we, Nick?
Yeah, I think when Tom's paper's published, we'll circulate a link to that as well. The link in the chat does have access to all of our resources and recordings from this and previous QIN meetups.
Very good. So that's all from us. A bit of time back before whatever you've got at 1 o'clock, hopefully. A bit of time to stretch your legs, get something to eat. Otherwise, thank you very much, everybody, for joining.